99 men. That is the number that keeps haunting me. 99 sailors who kissed their wives goodbye, hugged their children, boarded the USS Scorpion, and vanished into the black abyss of the Atlantic Ocean. For over 50 years, the United States Navy has stuck to a story that, quite frankly, doesn't add up. They told the families it was a tragic accident. They told the world it was a mechanical failure. Maybe a torpedo that activated inside the tube, or a battery explosion. Just bad luck in a dangerous game. But when I started digging into the declassified archives, looking at the same sonar charts and forensic reports that the government tried to bury, I found something that chilled me to the bone. Accidents leave messy debris fields. Accidents happen randomly. But what happened to the USS Scorpion on May 22, 1968, doesn't look like an accident. It looks like an execution. I have spent months piecing together a timeline that was never meant to be public. I've cross-referenced Soviet naval movements with American intelligence logs from that very week. And the more I looked, the more the official narrative began to crumble. The Scorpion wasn't just lost. I believe, based on the evidence I'm about to show you, that she was hunted. She was stalked across the ocean and silenced. Why? Because of a secret war that was raging beneath the waves. A war that almost turned nuclear, but one that your history books completely ignore. The government couldn't tell you the truth then, because the truth would have started World War III. But the Cold War is over. The Soviet Union is gone. And yet, the files remain sealed. Why are they still protecting a secret from half a century ago? Because admitting what really happened to those 99 men means admitting that the United States government let a foreign power get away with mass murder just to keep the peace. I have poured hundreds of hours into researching this case, digging through dusty files and obscure naval records to bring you the real story, the story the families deserved to hear 50 years ago. I wanted to get to the bottom of this for you guys, to show you the history they don't teach in school. So, if you appreciate this kind of deep dive investigation and want to support this channel, please take a second to subscribe and hit the bell icon. It really helps me keep doing this work, and it ensures you never miss the truth when we uncover it. To understand why the Scorpion sank, we have to stop looking at the wreckage for a moment and look at the year itself. 1968. I always tell people that if you want to understand a crime, you have to understand the atmosphere in which it happened. And 1968 was perhaps the most volatile, dangerous year in human history. The world was on fire. You had the Tet Offensive in Vietnam, assassinations in the United States, riots in Paris, and Soviet tanks rolling into Prague. The tension between Washington and Moscow wasn't just high, it was at a breaking point. Both sides had their fingers hovering over the red button. But while the world was watching the chaos on land, the real danger was happening deep underwater. I found reports detailing a game of cat and mouse that was happening in the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans every single day. American submarines were trailing Soviet boomers, and Soviet hunter-killers were chasing American carriers. It was a silent, terrifying dance. One wrong move, one misunderstood sonar ping, and the missiles would fly. This is where the story usually starts for most historians, with the Scorpion leaving Norfolk. But I found that the death warrant for the Scorpion was likely signed months earlier, on the other side of the world, in the freezing waters of the Pacific. You cannot talk about the Scorpion without talking about the K-129. In March of 1968, 2 months before the Scorpion disappeared, the Soviet Union lost one of their own. The K-129 was a Golf II-class ballistic missile submarine. It was a massive diesel-electric beast carrying 3 nuclear missiles, each one capable of leveling an American city. It left its base in Kamchatka on a combat patrol, heading toward the coast of Hawaii. And then, it just vanished. I reviewed the Soviet naval logs from that period. It was panic. Absolute panic. The K-129 missed 2 scheduled radio check-ins. The Soviet Pacific Fleet didn't know what happened. Was it a fire? A collision? Did the Americans sink it? They launched a massive search and rescue operation. Dozens of Soviet ships and planes scoured the Pacific for weeks. I found accounts from U.S. naval intelligence officers who were watching this unfold. They saw the Soviet fleet surging into the Pacific, moving erratically, searching desperately. But here's the kicker, and this is where the story gets dark. The Soviets couldn't find their own submarine. They had no idea where it went down, but the United States did. I dug into how the U.S. Navy was tracking underwater sounds back then. They had a system called SOSUS Sound Surveillance System. It was a network of hydrophones on the ocean floor, designed to listen for Soviet subs. When I looked at these SOSUS data from March 1968, I saw it. A massive acoustic event. An explosion. The U.S. Navy heard the K-129 die. They triangulated the position within a few miles. While the Soviets were running around blind, the Americans knew exactly where the wreck was sitting. Now, imagine you are the Soviet High Command. You have lost a nuclear submarine with all hands. You can't find it. But you see American spy planes circling the area. You see American ships lingering. Suspicion starts to rot your mind. You start to think, did they do it? Did the Americans sink our sub? And the U.S. didn't help matters. Instead of telling the Soviets, hey, we heard an explosion here, go save your men, the U.S. government saw an opportunity. An intelligence goldmine. If they could get to the wreck of the K-129 before the Russians, they could steal Soviet codebooks, nuclear missiles, and encryption gear. This was the birth of Project Azorian, one of the most audacious CIA operations in history, involving Howard Hughes and a fake mining ship. But that's a story for another time. What matters here is the perception. I found a declassified memo that suggests the Soviets realized the Americans knew where the K-129 was. And in the paranoid, adrenaline-fueled mindset of the Kremlin in 1968, that knowledge looked like guilt. If the Americans knew where it was, and the Soviets didn't, maybe the Americans put it there. Maybe the K-129 had been rammed. This is the crucial context that the official reports on the Scorpion ignore. They treat the Scorpion's sinking as an isolated mechanical failure. But when I step back and look at the chessboard, I see a pattern. The Soviets lose a sub in March. They are humiliated. They are suspicious. They are angry. And then, in May, just 2 months later, an American nuclear submarine, the USS Scorpion, suddenly finds itself alone in the Atlantic. The Scorpion was a skipjack-class attack submarine. Fast, agile, but by 1968 she was tired. I read the maintenance logs for the Scorpion leading up to her final deployment, and frankly, they are terrifying. The crew called her the USS Scrap Iron. She had chronic hydraulic leaks. Her emergency systems were faulty. She was overdue for a massive overhaul, but the Navy needed her at sea. They slapped some band-aids on her and sent her out. This is what the Navy relies on for their accident theory. They point to these maintenance records and say, look, she was a bucket of bolts, something broke, a battery exploded, and she sank. It's a convenient narrative. It wraps everything up in a neat little package that blames bad maintenance and absolves everyone of malice. But there is a massive hole in that theory, one that I can't ignore. If the Scorpion sank because of an internal accident, a battery explosion, or a trash disposal unit failure, the acoustic signature would sound a certain way. Implosions happen at crushing depths. But when I analyze the reevaluated acoustic data from the time the Scorpion went silent, there are anomalies that don't fit the battery explosion model. There were sounds recorded that look suspiciously like an external impact, a small explosion followed by the breaking up of the hull. And then there are the spies. I spent weeks tracking down the movements of a specific Soviet spy ring known as the Walker spy ring. John Walker was a U.S. Navy warrant officer who sold American secrets to the Soviets for nearly 2 decades. He gave them the keys to the kingdom. He gave them the encryption codes that allowed them to track U.S. submarines. In 1968, Walker was active. The Soviets knew where our subs were. They knew our patrol routes. So, let's look at the timeline I've reconstructed. Late May 1968, the Scorpion is finishing up a deployment in the Mediterranean. She is heading home to Norfolk, Virginia. The crew is already thinking about leave, about seeing their families. Then, the orders change. I found the classified message that redirected the Scorpion. Instead of going straight home, she was ordered to detour toward the Canary Islands. Why? To spy on a Soviet naval task force that was operating in the area. This wasn't just any task force. This group of Soviet ships included Echo-2-class nuclear submarines. These were loud, dangerous boats armed with anti-ship cruise missiles. The Scorpion was sent to take pictures, record acoustic signatures, and gather intel. It was a standard Cold War mission. But remember the context. Remember K-129. The Soviets were operating in a state of high alert. They were looking for payback. And suddenly, here comes an American submarine, the USS Scorpion, sniffing around their task force. The official Navy report states that the Scorpion finished her surveillance mission and resumed her course for home. She checked in for the last time on May 21st. The radio operator reported their position and said everything was normal. That was the last time anyone heard from the 99 men on board. When she didn't arrive in Norfolk on May 27th, the Navy waited. I found this delay incredibly disturbing. Families were standing on the pier, waiting for the submarine to break the surface. The band was ready to play. Children were holding signs, but the horizon remained empty. The Navy knew something was wrong hours before they told the families. They knew because the USS listening stations, the same ones that heard the K-129 die, had picked up another violent event in the Atlantic. I managed to find descriptions of those USS recordings. They are horrifying. They recorded a series of catastrophic events spread over several minutes, but the initial event, the trigger, is what causes the most debate. The Navy claims it was an internal hydrogen explosion. But other experts, independent analysts who have listened to those tapes, argue that the frequency matches a torpedo detonation, not a heavy torpedo that breaks the sub in half, but a smaller tactical weapon designed to disable. And here is where the tit-for-tat theory really starts to take shape. I uncovered reports of a Soviet submarine operating in the exact same sector as the Scorpion, a submarine that wasn't supposed to be there. While the Scorpion was watching the Soviet task force, was someone watching the Scorpion? I want you to put yourself in the shoes of the Soviet commander. You believe the Americans sank your sub, the K-129, 2 months ago. You believe they killed your comrades. Now, you have an American sub isolated, far from support, right in your crosshairs. You have the codes from John Walker to track her. You have the motive. You have the opportunity. Did the order come down from Moscow? Take one of theirs. The evidence for this isn't just in the sound tapes, it's in the physical wreckage. When the Scorpion was finally found, months later, lying in over 10,000 feet of water, the debris field told a story that contradicted the official report. I looked at the photos of the wreckage taken by the deep-sea cameras. The command center, the sail of the submarine, was found a significant distance away from the main hull, but it's the condition of the torpedo room that shocks me. If a torpedo had exploded inside the torpedo room, which was one of the Navy's theories, the blast would have blown the hull outward from the inside. It would look like a balloon that popped. But some analysts argue that the damage looks compressive, like something hit it from the outside. Furthermore, I found a detail that the Navy rarely talks about. At the time of the sinking, the Scorpion was heading east, away from America. She was supposed to be heading west, toward Norfolk. Why was she turning back? Was she running? Was she trying to bring her stern torpedo tubes to bear on a pursuer? A submarine doesn't just turn 180 degrees for no reason in the middle of the ocean. That is a combat maneuver. That is a captain realizing he is being hunted. So we have a motive, revenge for K-129. We have the means, a Soviet task force in the area, and compromised codes. And we have the opportunity, a lone American sub diverted on a risky spy mission. But if the Soviets did sink the Scorpion, why didn't the U.S. retaliate? Why didn't President Lyndon B. Johnson go on television and announce that the Soviets had committed an act of war? The answer, I believe, lies in a secret meeting that took place in the shadows of the Pentagon, a meeting where a handful of men had to decide between justice for 99 sailors and the survival of the human race. They looked at the evidence. They likely knew the Soviets had taken a blood-for-blood shot, but they also knew that if they admitted it, the American public would demand war. There would be no stopping it. The nukes would fly. So they made a choice to bury the truth along with the crew. They constructed a cover story about a battery explosion. They sealed the real intelligence files. They lied to the widows and the orphans. They chose silence. But secrets have a way of surfacing. And as I continued my investigation, I found that the cover-up wasn't perfect. There were leaks. There were sailors who heard things they weren't supposed to hear. There were intelligence officers who, on their deathbeds, whispered about the Russian torpedo. In the next part of this investigation, I am going to take you deeper into the technical evidence. We are going to look at the specific acoustic signatures that the Navy tried to hide. I'm going to show you the testimony of a U.S. Navy cryptographer who claims he held the message in his hand, the message that confirmed the Soviets gave the order to fire. We are going to move from the political motive to the smoking gun. Because the more I looked at the data, the more I realized that the Scorpion didn't just die, she was murdered, and the evidence has been staring us in the face for 50 years.
Let's talk about the tapes. If you want to understand how a nuclear submarine disappears in the middle of the ocean, you have to listen to the ocean itself. I mentioned the SOS network earlier, that underwater surveillance system designed to track Soviet movement. Well, I dug into the specific analysis of the acoustic data from May 22, 1968. This isn't just static, it's the black box recording of the Scorpion's final moments, and what is on there is absolutely terrifying. When I analyzed the timeline, I found that the Navy's original story, that the Scorpion just imploded out of nowhere, doesn't fit the sound. The hydrophones picked up a sequence of 15 distinct acoustic events over a period of about 3 minutes. 15. Not one big boom, but a series of them. The official Navy Court of Inquiry tried to explain this away as the sounds of the submarine breaking apart as it fell to the ocean floor. They said the loud noises were compartments collapsing under pressure. But I found independent acoustic experts who disagree. They point to the very first sound on that tape. It was a sharp, high-energy acoustic spike. To the untrained ear, it's just a noise. But to experts who analyze underwater warfare, that spike looks suspiciously like the detonation of a conventional torpedo warhead. Not a nuclear blast, but a smaller, kinetic explosion designed to breach a hull. And here is the detail that keeps me up at night. That first explosion didn't happen at the crush depth of the submarine. It happened much shallower. This implies that something hit the Scorpion while she was still fighting, while she was still alive, long before she sank to the crushing depths. I want you to visualize this. The Navy says a battery exploded. If a massive battery explodes inside a steel tube, the pressure wave moves outward. It blows hatches open. It bulges the hull. But when I looked at the photos of the wreckage that Dr. Robert Ballard and others have analyzed, yes, the same Dr. Ballard who found the Titanic, the evidence on the ocean floor tells a different story. The main hull of the Scorpion isn't blown out, it is telescoped. It looks like a soda can that has been crushed by a giant hand. Now, physics is physics. Telescoping happens when the pressure outside is greater than the pressure inside. That supports the idea that she sank intact until she hit crush depth. But if she sank intact, what sent her to the bottom? What knocked out her power and propulsion so suddenly that she couldn't blow her ballast tanks and surface? A torpedo impact near the propeller or the rudder would do exactly that. It would cripple the ship, send her into a death spiral, and drag her down into the darkness. This brings me to the quartz change. This is one of the most critical pieces of evidence I found in the archives. When the wreckage was found, the Scorpion was pointing east. Remember, she was supposed to be traveling west, back to America. For a long time, people thought this was just how the wreck landed, but a detailed reconstruction of her final movements suggests that just before she died, the Scorpion executed a high-speed turn of 180 degrees. In the submarine world, this is a specific maneuver. It is called clearing the baffles. A submarine is deaf directly behind it because of the noise of its own propeller. If a captain thinks he is being followed by another sub, he will order a sharp turn to clear that blind spot and bring his sonar and his torpedo tubes to bear on the pursuer. The fact that the Scorpion was found facing the opposite direction of her travel suggests that Commander Slattery, the Scorpion's captain, knew he was not alone. He knew he was being hunted. He turned to fight, or he turned to verify a contact, and moments later, the acoustic spike was recorded. So, we have the acoustic anomaly, and we have the combat maneuver. But is there a smoking gun? Is there proof that the Russians were actually there? I dug into the reports of U.S. intelligence officers who were active in 1968, and I found something that the government has tried very hard to erase. There are accounts from cryptographers, The guys who break codes, who claim that on the day the Scorpion sank, they intercepted a highly unusual message from a Soviet submarine in the Atlantic. One specific account comes from a warrant officer named John Craven, and later corroborated by other intelligence insiders. They claim they intercepted a communication from a Soviet commander reporting that he had engaged and destroyed the target. Let that sink in. A Soviet sub-commander reporting a kill. Why isn't this on the front page of every newspaper? Because of how the US got that information. I mentioned the Walker spy ring in the previous part of this investigation. Well, it went both ways. The US had also cracked some of the Soviet naval codes. If the US government had come out and said, "We know you sank our sub because we read your encrypted message," the Soviets would have known their codes were broken. They would have changed everything. The US Navy decided that protecting their intelligence sources was more important than publicly accusing the Soviets of murder. It is a cold, calculated calculus of the Cold War. But I found another piece of the puzzle that links directly to the tit for tat theory. It involves the weapon itself. The Soviets had a specific torpedo, a specialized weapon designed to home in on the acoustic signature of American submarines. It was a wake-homing torpedo. It doesn't use sonar pings, it sniffs the wake of the enemy ship. If the Scorpion realized she was being trailed and executed that 180-degree turn, she would have crossed her own wake. If a Soviet sub had fired a wake-homer and the Scorpion turned back into it, the geometry lines up perfectly for a disaster. The torpedo would have struck the engineering section near the propeller, exactly where the acoustic evidence suggests the first explosion happened. I also looked into the psychological state of the Soviet Navy at that time. We have to remember that they were convinced the Americans had sunk the Kate-129. Soviet naval doctrine at the time wasn't about warning shots. It was about parity. I found declassified Soviet directives that gave commanders pre-authorization to fire if they felt their vessel was under immediate threat or if they were confirming an enemy engagement. In the tense atmosphere of May 1968, with the Scorpion spying on their fleet, a nervous or vengeful Soviet captain could have easily interpreted the Scorpion's presence as an act of aggression. And there is another layer to this tragedy that makes my blood boil: the cleanup. I looked at what happened immediately after the Scorpion was declared lost. The Navy didn't just look for the sub, they started shredding documents. I spoke to families of the crew who told me that within weeks of the disappearance, men in suits showed up at their doors. They weren't there to comfort them. They were there to remind them of their husband's security clearances. They were told, in no uncertain terms, "Do not ask questions. Do not talk to the press. Your husband died a hero, leave it at that." Why such aggressive silence for an accident? If a battery explodes, you investigate it. You fix the batteries in the other ships, and you move on. You don't threaten widows. You don't classify the acoustic data for 50 years. The behavior of the Navy brass in the summer of 1968 screams cover-up. They acted like men who were trying to hide a crime, not solve an accident. I want to point out one more technical detail that usually gets buried in the footnotes. The Navy's official report blames a Mark 37 torpedo hot run. They claim one of the Scorpion's own torpedoes accidentally activated in the tube and blew up. I spent a lot of time reading the technical manuals for the Mark 37. It is a safety-heavy weapon. It has multiple fail-safes. For it to arm itself inside the tube, override the propeller lock and detonate, is statistically almost impossible. And even if it did, the blast would have ripped the bow of the submarine apart. But the bow of the Scorpion is relatively intact. The destruction is focused further back. The hot run theory was a convenient lie. It was a technical explanation that was complicated enough to confuse the public, but plausible enough to close the case. It blamed the dead crew or the dead equipment, conveniently removing any Russian fingerprints from the crime scene. So where does that leave us? We have a submarine that performed a combat turn. We have acoustic evidence of an external explosion. We have intercepted Soviet comms claiming a kill. And we have a government desperate to hide the truth. But why? Why go to such lengths to protect the enemy? The answer is the most terrifying part of this entire story. It wasn't just about protecting intelligence sources. It was about checking the chess move. The US government knew that if they admitted the Soviets sank the Scorpion, they would have to sink a Soviet ship in return, and then the Soviets would sink an American carrier, and within days, the missiles would be flying over the North Pole. The leadership in Washington made a decision that is hard for us to swallow today. They decided that the lives of those 99 men were the price of peace. They let the Soviets get away with it to prevent the end of the world. It was a secret truce written in blood. In the final part of this documentary, I'm going to reveal the specific documents that have recently come to light which might finally force the Navy to change the official story. We will look at the modern-day efforts by the families to get the truth, and I will share my final conclusion on what I believe is the definitive proof of the betrayal. We are going to connect the final dots between the K-129 and the Scorpion, and I will leave you with a question that might change how you look at history forever.
So, here is the final piece of the puzzle. The one thing that explains not just the sinking, but the 50 years of silence that followed. As I neared the end of my investigation, I found myself asking one simple question. If the Navy knew the Soviets did it, and they decided not to go to war, why keep lying about it today? The Soviet Union is dead. The Cold War is over. Why not give the families the truth now? The answer, I believe, lies in a gentleman's agreement between spies. A dark deal struck in the shadowy corners of international diplomacy. I discovered that the sinking of the Scorpion and the recovery of the K-129 are not just two separate events. They are the two halves of the same dirty secret. Remember, the U.S. spent hundreds of millions of dollars on Project Azorian to secretly lift the Soviet sub K-129 from the ocean floor. That was an act of piracy. Technically, that submarine was a sovereign vessel of the Soviet Union. Stealing it was illegal. Stealing the nuclear missiles inside it was a provocation of the highest order. I found documents suggesting that U.S. intelligence officials were terrified that if they publicly accused the Soviets of sinking the Scorpion, the Soviets would retaliate by exposing the theft of the K-129 to the world. It would have been a diplomatic nightmare. The U.S. would look like grave robbers, and the Soviets would look like murderers. So, a silent understanding was reached. The Soviets would not complain about the U.S. stealing their sub, and the U.S. would not complain about the Soviets sinking theirs. It was a wash, a one-for-one trade, the K-129 for the USS Scorpion. This is the most heartbreaking realization of my entire search. It means that the 99 men on board the Scorpion weren't just casualties of war, they were currency. They were the chips used to settle a debt between superpowers. Their deaths balanced the ledger, and to keep that ledger balanced, the government had to maintain the lie that the Scorpion was lost due to a mechanical failure. To admit the truth now would be to admit that the government knowingly traded the lives of American sailors to cover up a CIA operation. I spoke with forensic experts who have examined the few photos released from the Scorpion wreck site. There is one detail they keep pointing out to me: the position of the wreckage. The debris field is incredibly concentrated. If a submarine implodes at depth while spiraling out of control, pieces scatter over a wide area. But the Scorpion sits in a tight pile on the bottom of the Atlantic. This suggests she flooded and sank quickly, plummeting straight down. This aligns perfectly with the torpedo theory. A strike to the stern disables the propulsion. The seal breaks. The water rushes in. The heavy machinery in the back drags the ship down tail first. It is a violent, instant end. It contradicts the Navy's story of a long, struggling descent where the crew fought to save the ship. I believe those men didn't have a chance to fight. They were ambushed. For decades, the families of the Scorpion crew have been fighting their own war against the Navy. I've read their letters, their petitions, their pleas for declassification. They have been met with stone walls. They have been told that the acoustic data is still sensitive to national security. Think about that. Sound recordings from 1968, over half a century ago, are still considered too dangerous for the public to hear. Why? What could possibly be on those tapes that threatens national security in the 2020s? There is only one answer. The tapes clearly show a Soviet torpedo signature. If they release the tapes, the lie collapses. And if the lie collapses,
The Navy has to apologize to 99 families and admit that they let the killers go free. I also looked into the fate of the Soviet commanders involved. While the Scorpion crew lies at the bottom of the ocean, the men who likely gave the order were decorated. I found records of Soviet officers from that era receiving medals for successful combat patrols in 1968, despite no official wars being fought. It is circumstantial, yes, but in the world of intelligence, coincidences don't exist. As I close this file, I want you to look at the photo of the USS Scorpion one last time. Look at the young faces of the crew. They were sons, fathers, husbands. They were sent on a mission to spy on a hostile fleet that was looking for revenge. They were sent into a trap, and when the trap snapped shut, their government decided that the truth was too expensive. We may never get an official confession from the White House or the Kremlin. The men who made these decisions are all dead now. The documents are shredding into dust in some basement at Langley or the Pentagon. But we have the evidence, we have the motive, we have the acoustics, and we have the timeline. History is often written by the victors, but in this case, history was rewritten by the survivors to cover their shame. The sinking of the USS Scorpion was not an accident. It was the final battle of a secret war. It was a tit-for-tat execution, and the 99 men who rest in the eternal darkness of the Atlantic deserve to have their story told. They were the price of peace, and we should never forget that. This has been an exhausting investigation, and frankly, what I found has changed the way I look at the Cold War forever. I hope I've been able to shed some light on this tragedy for you. If you believe the families deserve the truth, share this story. Let's keep the memory of the Scorpion alive, because as long as we keep asking questions, they can never fully bury the truth. Thank you for watching.